Hi everyone, how are you? Thank you guys. If you joined me last week, thanks for coming back this week. I am going to talk about my favorite thing to talk about, which is person first language, also known as people first language, and disability etiquette. So I will let you know my chat is popping up and popping in and out. So if you say something in the chat, I think CJ is going to help me, but also feel free to unmute yourself and interject as you would like. So if you were here with us last week, you know that we are part of WVU as well as the Health Science Center. And we're also part of a national network called AUCD. I'm just going to go over this briefly in case some of you were not part of it last week, but I strongly encourage you to get on AUCD's website. There's a conference that's held every year. It'll be in December this year virtually. Normally it's in November and it's held in DC. There's a ton of webinars that they hold. There's a lot of policy driven information. In fact, I always make my policy students really do a thorough read through of this website because there's a ton of information on it. We also provide multiple roles throughout the state, so not just to the university, but also to the state and to professionals throughout. And of course, we cover the whole state of West Virginia. The counties in blue that you see are counties
Join the meeting
in which we have individuals' house. So this is where their offices are. However, they are covering the whole state. I will let you know that Mon County here in Morgantown, as well as in Big Chimney, right outside Charleston, and Kanawha County are where our two main offices are located. The rest of our staff are distributed throughout DHHR buildings around the state. And also to let you know, we are providing and we have continued to provide services to the community, including trainings and all of that all throughout COVID. If you want to become an affiliate of ours, you can get on our website and get on the listserv. You'll see a lot of information about trainings. You'll see feedback and opportunities for different grants that we do. And you'll also see research that comes out of our institution. All right, so now that I've done my spiel, and I'll do it every single day that you see me, just because I do it always, and I don't want to miss anyone that maybe didn't join before. But now we can get to talking about what we're here to talk about, which is person first or people first language. So what is it? So historically, person first or people first language, I'm going to call it person first. I'd use them interchangeably. They're the same thing, just whatever kind of rolls off your tongue better. They have been used when talking about individuals with disabilities. So it's a way to speak appropriately and respectfully about an individual with a disability without putting emphasis on their disability. So for instance, you would say a person with autism, that's person first language, versus an autistic person. So I'm gonna kind of throw this out there to everyone, and I can see the chat right now. So do you think that person first language is used exclusively for people with disabilities, or do you think that it can be used when speaking about other various groups and forms of diversity? Okay, nope. Many other forms, okay. All groups. Okay, looking good. All right, so I will tell you that traditionally, person first language is used, it kind of surfaced in the field of disabilities, and it's not really used too much in other fields. So, but I will tell you, it completely applies. So whenever I was developing this training, I really started thinking about it and said, okay, this makes perfect sense. Like a person with autism is not exclusively autistic, right? There's many other parts of them. But it also makes sense that a person who is Hispanic is not exclusively Hispanic, or a person who is Jewish is not exclusively Jewish. So these things, while they're not in literature and all of that, you're not going to see it a whole lot in using when talking about other forms of diversity or other populations. It 100% applies. And in fact, if you think about it, it really makes sense to do it for all populations. So I'm going to throw this out there. Have any of you ever been labeled? CJ says, sure. Yep. Yeah. So you don't have to answer this, but obviously there's people that have been labeled based on their sexuality, based on their race, their gender, their sex. So, keeping those two things separately, even they're all of these things, right? How about where they're from? I don't know how many native West Virginians we have on here. I'm assuming everyone on here probably lives in West Virginia currently. So you've probably been labeled a West Virginian, right? And what happens when you're labeled that? Are there stereotypes that go along with that? Are you treated differently? Yeah, hillbilly, all of that. Typically not in a good way, unless they've been to West Virginia and they've really had some experience with West Virginia. And then that people know that we're not all the stereotypes they are. For instance, I was at a conference across the country and I was speaking to someone. We were talking about some different things and they were like, you have a very interesting accent. Where are you from? And I'm like, oh, I'm from Southern West Virginia. And they're like, oh, well, I didn't expect you to be that well educated being from there. Or it goes into like, oh, well, you have nice shoes, or you have all your teeth, or whatever it is, right? And then from that moment that that person finds out that I'm from West Virginia, they kind of almost doubt the things I said before because they don't necessarily think we're credited, right? So making sure that you acknowledge that everyone's been labeled to some degree, probably, if only as a West Virginian. And typically the way you've been labeled is going to also dictate how some people treat you. So I love this. I love this quote because I think it's extremely important. I think it's accurate as can be. If you change your language, you change your thoughts. If you change your thoughts, you change your actions, right? You change your behaviors. It's a core principle of CBT therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, right? You change how you think about something, you change those perceptions, you change your cognitions around it and your behaviors around it. And this is extremely important. If you make even the subtlest change in your language, you can change exactly how you treat someone. So let's dive into it a little bit further here, okay? So we know that there's tons of effects of labeling. And I think some of them we are more aware of than others, but labeling or stereotyping, it can create barriers, but at the same time, it can also create opportunities. Now that's kind of wild for some of us to wrap our brains around because we're thought, oh, well, the creating barriers and holding people back, like that's a terrible thing. But there are opportunities. So for instance, if you are Native American and you have a certain percentage, there's funding out there for education allotted to that. That affiliation with that diversity, that affiliation with that population, with that heritage, it opens opportunities that someone without that may not have. Now, I'll tell you, do the opportunities outweigh the barriers? Most of the time not, right? There's typically always more barriers for people from diverse backgrounds than there's ever opportunities. It can also foster epidemics of ignorance. So it reinforces those stereotypes. You start to tell jokes about people from West Virginia and all of that stuff, more people hear it, more people think it's true, right? But it can also celebrate differences in a good way and a bad way. So when I think about this, I always think about things such as like gay pride or LGBTQ centers or African American Black history centers and things like that. And there's this whole argument about like these things shouldn't exist, right? Because people should be safe everywhere, no matter what race you are, no matter what sexuality you are, what gender. A student organization should be available to everyone. They should not have to have their own safe place. When you start to think about the emergence of like Stonewall and other gay bars like that happened in the 60s and 70s, those were created as a safe haven because there was nowhere safe for those individuals any longer. Well, now that our society is changing and we are becoming mainstream and accepting different forms of diversity, the necessity of those places isn't quite there as much. However, we still see the argument of that having things like gay pride and things like that are ways to celebrate the fact that you are unique and that there's nothing wrong with it. And to also celebrate that we've come so far from oppression. Same thing with disability pride. A lot of people say that it shouldn't be that big of a deal. What a lot of people say is, I'm going to celebrate it because for a long time it was a big deal. And now I can celebrate it as if it's a very positive thing. Are there any other effects to labeling that anyone knows? I would like for everyone to identify one effect of labeling in the chat. Beyond kind of the ones that we talked about here. Or even an explicit example. Reductionist, yeah. Internalizing of labels. Limits learning about the whole person. Oh, so yeah, so it really starts to put a lens over how people view you. Less than self-work. Wonderful. Wonderful. All these are great examples. So you remember I told you earlier, language and how we talk about people is extremely powerful. It's powerful in how we form our own attitudes towards others, but it's also powerful in how we help others form those attitudes for them. So the way we speak or we write about someone will strongly influence the image or attitudes that we and other people form about them. So for instance, I do case notes, right? So if I'm doing case notes on a client with high behaviors and I'm writing things such as this person engages in physical aggression 35 times on average an hour, they throw feces at people, all of these great things, right? That's going to paint a picture for that person. When that chart comes across that next person's desk and they read it, that's going to paint that picture of them, right? Based on what I've told them. So when they go in that situation, do you think that it's going to be a nice picture that gets painted? Do you think that they're going to go in there really comfortable and casual? No, because you didn't paint a really accurate picture necessarily. Maybe you painted somewhat one, but not fully. Instead, they're probably going to go in there guarded, right? I'm going to go in there saying, well, I don't want poop thrown at me, or I don't want to be hit today, so I'm going to stay back. My behavior towards that person is going to change based on that script that was provided in my head on the information that was given to me. And that's where it's important that we find that if you don't paint an accurate picture or anything like that, if you don't put accurate information in that information, then that person's going to have a distorted view of that person and they're going to behave based on that. So they're going to see the person as maybe challenging, as very in negative ways. So they're going to base their behaviors on that. So it's important that we leave those positive, lasting impressions on individuals. Think of it this way. I like to equate identities and labels in a way that is very concrete. So when you go to the eye doctor, they put this thing over your face, right? And they start to click things down. And every time they click it, it kind of distorts the way you're looking at it. Either it makes it clearer or it makes it a little foggier, right? So when you're talking to someone, when you're learning about someone, when you're meeting someone, you're reading about them, the exact same thing happens. As you're reading, things start to click down. So you're reading about a case. You read, okay, they have autism, click. Well, now I'm viewing them through the lens of someone with autism, right? Now, maybe they're Black, click. So now I'm viewing them through the lens of someone who is autistic and also is Black. All right, now click again. So every single time, an identity it's kind of a filter that other people are viewing you through, and you yourself are viewing the world through. If we don't make sure that we are clicking things down and we're acknowledging that these things are clicked down, then we're not going to have an appropriate and a holistic view of the person. More than likely, we're going to have a distorted view of them. So I like to really think about that, because really sometimes it depends on, like, if you have strong feelings between one of those clicks, right? So if I have strong feelings behind someone who's gay, guess what's going to happen? Those feelings are going to distort that lens. So I'm going to view them through those feelings, those biases that I carry along with me, which is extremely important that we don't focus on people's identities exclusive, because that's where we can start to really put them in those baskets in people's brains and put them in those like stereotyped categories. Instead, you just view them as a person with all these attributes. So this says incorrect versus correct. That's kind of This is incorrect versus correct people first language. Now, the next slide, I'm going to show you what's called identity first, which is the flip side of this. So instead of a person with a disability, identity first states a disabled person. And I will show you a video that talks about that. But let's look at this kind of that looks at person first language first. So do any of these surprise anyone? Are there any that kind of stand out to you that you're looking at? Well, the one that stands out to me, I think most of these, we can all get on board with. I will point out that this term MR is no longer used clinically or in any context, so we don't use it. We really say an individual with an intellectual cognitive disability. So that's kind of a theoretical change from where we were maybe about 10 years ago. But other than that, this very last one, handicap parking or bathroom. Do you guys see that a lot? Do you see it places? I see signs with it, right? But let's think about the word handicap. When you hear that word, what do you think it means? What's your gut when you hear it? What are you thinking? Like, what's your go-to reference? Incapable. Yeah. I mean, really, if you just start to break down the words, you have handy and capped, right? So someone somewhere along the lines, they are capped at something. So it means that they just can't do that. Well, what we find is that most people are not really handicapped. They're not really capped at anything. Yes, they may be delayed in areas, but with assistive technology, with a different approach, with skill building, with all of these things, most people can move beyond that thing that we artificially set them at. And that's kind of what happens is we artificially set them at that. So that's kind of what handicap means. Now, does it make sense that a parking spot or a bathroom is handicapped? No, that's not really what we're talking about here, are we? What we're talking about is that these parking spots and these bathrooms are larger in size, so people can get inside of them, right? In a wheelchair. So they're accessible. So while this may seem like a really minor thing, this word handicapped, and the video is going to touch about this anyway, it puts a kind of this negative connotation that someone's never going to move beyond. And we know that that's really not the case. And we also know that an inanimate object is not capped at anything, right? So this is kind of where we're failing as a society to change our language and to move along with what we're learning about things. So instead of using the word handicapped, I instruct you guys to use the words accessible parking or accessible bathrooms. I also will say the large stall instead of the accessible stall sometimes, because that's what it is. It's large. All right, so I have to tell you, and you guys will be learning about accessibility from me Friday, I think. I do not embed my videos, sorry about that, into my PowerPoints because closed captioning does not always work for it. So were you able to see me transition a simple head nod from somebody? Okay, great. So this video, everything I've talked about up to this point is person first language. But we have to acknowledge that there is a flip side to this, which is called identity first language. So identity first language is the opposite of people first. So I'll use autism, for example. Person first language or people first language is a person with autism versus identity first is an autistic person. Now, I think, and we'll touch on this later, I think that person first language is the safer route. I think it's the more respectful route, and it's kind of less presumptuous. So I always defer to it. However, we have to acknowledge that there are people that subscribe to the opposite. And so what I like to do is I like to show you a video where someone who actually uses identity first language explains it to you. So enjoy this video.
Hello. It's Let's Talk Tuesday, so let's talk a little bit about disability, identity, and language. I want to preface my thoughts on this by saying that every single individual on this planet can identify differently, and that's okay. We should all try and make efforts to ask individuals how they would like to be referred to instead of assuming, and respecting that and using the language that honors them. One's identity is not typically up for debate, so just be respectful of how someone wishes to be addressed. So, person first versus identity first language. There are people who identify as person first, i.e., person with a disability, and there are people who identify as identity first, i.e., disabled person. There are quite a few people who use person first based on the idea that they are people first and that disability is secondary or a trait. Personally, I identify as identity first because my identities and my communities are a huge part of who I am and how I move through the world and how I experience my life. So I am honored by their recognition. I am a queer, Latinx, disabled woman. These identities vary throughout this humongous and diverse community. So while there are a lot of people who identify as autistic, there are also a lot of people who will identify as a person with autism. There's also people who identify as quadriplegic, while there are people who identify as a person with quadriplegia, and so on. Even in my specific corner of the community, there are people with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and there are EDSers. There are people who are wheelchair bound, and there are wheelchair users, of which I personally prefer the latter, because wheelchair bound has this negative connotation to it, like bound or trapped, limited, which is actually the complete opposite of the function of a wheelchair. Without it, I'm essentially homebound, bedbound, but with it, I gain freedom, mobility privilege. For many, including myself, that's also an economic privilege. With a power chair, I gain independence. So, wheelchair user, not wheelchair bound. I personally identify with identity first, but I'm not offended by person first language. I think that might actually be the safest approach when referring to large groups, like people with disabilities. But I don't know, feel free to let me know your thoughts on that. But I feel like person first might be less likely to ruffle some feathers. But I don't know. What I do know is that if you are writing anything or introducing someone as an individual, you should ask them specifically how they identify and be respectful to that language. Now, disability versus the plethora of words created to replace that word. All right, so disability is not a bad word, even if society tried to make it into one. Hashtag disabled, not Voldemort. Hashtag say the word disabled. I personally, when being referred to, I cannot stand terms like differently abled. Because specifically differently abled, I feel like it's such a big cop-out. Like, everyone has different abilities. Everyone is differently abled. It erases the oppression that people within the disability community face. Then stuff like special and handicapped and handy-capable. I do not like any of them, but only recently, this year, did I learn that handicapped itself is actually considered a slur. I didn't know that. I think the word disability is important. I think it's important to recognize and remember that there is a specific community of people that have historically been oppressed and continue to be oppressed to this day. And I think it's important for that community of people to have the word disability and have the word disabled and to be able to have disability pride and be proud and be out in the world as disabled. All right, I think that's all I have for now.
Okay, I have to apologize because normally I make sure the closed captioning was on and I did not turn it on automatically. So I apologize for that. If you're interested in this video, I can also send the link out to you and you have it. But there was a whole lot that happened in this video. I feel like there was a lot to unpack here, right? I like to start talking about the language that she used. So there were a couple words in there that maybe you're not familiar with, or because I wasn't, or maybe your reference for them is slightly different than what hers was. So first one we'll talk about is Latinx. So does anyone know what Latinx is in terms of an identity? I did not know this one. So Latinx is a gender neutral term for someone, yes, of Latin descent. So, as much that you know about that language, I'm not Spanish speaking, but I do know that there is feminized and masculinized terms. Now, acknowledging that you have to fit into one of those categories, right? Or you're left in between. Someone like myself is kind of left in between. I don't quite fit into the female one. I don't quite fit into the male one. So where does that leave me? Well, that leaves me one in a genderless state. So that's where Latinx comes from. The next word I want to talk about is the word queer. So the word queer, curious, do you guys think that's a positive or a negative term? Don't go by what she says. Just what's your feelings around that? Do you think it's a positive or a negative term when you hear it? Negative. Okay. Negative. Positive these days. Someone said, you know the cheat, don't you? You know the secret. It's fluctuated. Yes. So I'm right at that age gap in my early 30s, right at that brink of when the word queer was exclusively, like historically, like my life experiences, it was used in a very negative way, right? So it was used to degrade someone. Being queer was not a form of something you would want to be prideful of, all of those things. Now, as I'm getting older, I'm seeing the generations below me really start to change that. So it has been taken on by many individuals in the LGBTQ community. It's even in there. Actually, it's to be really, if you really want to be distinct, it's LGBTQQIA, and then some other things. But one of those Q's is queer. And what it is how, at least how a lot of people are using it, is more of a neutral stance. So it's a more neutral and fluid form of sexuality. So they don't necessarily identify as homosexual. They don't identify as bisexual necessarily or anything like that. It's just used more as a neutral term. Same with gender. So you'll hear people say that, what gender do you identify as? Well, I'm queer, which typically means that they don't feel like they fit in one of those kind of pre-designed boxes that society's put out there for us. Now, thankfully, over time, those boxes have gotten added, maybe got a little bit bigger, but they don't fit into that. So the word queer is an example of how sometimes language can change, but that doesn't change the feelings and the associations that you have with that word either, right? So for a long time, when I started hearing my students or hearing other people like identify that way, I was like, why would you ever say that about yourself? Because my history of that word was not that. So I have to be very aware of that, especially when I'm working with someone who has that identity. Because for me, I'm like feeling bad for them that they're identifying this way. but for them, they're being prideful. Okay, they're embracing that as an identity. So it's important that we acknowledge that. And I always bring that up because I find that I have people on both sides of that bracket where, they have that, they know the experience with it is very negative, versus you may have people that are like 19 and 20 or something like that, their whole life or most of their life, that's not been a bad word. It's just been a form of identity to them. So it's important that we also acknowledge kind of what we bring to the table when it comes to language. So some basic, tips on how do you replace unacceptable language. Now, I'm going to say disability here on some of these, but I'm going to tell you that you should apply it to everything. So don't refer to a person's disability or race or gender or sexuality or religion or any of those things unless it's relevant to the conversation. And it happens all the time. I'll give you an example. This is an example I give every single time because this example really shocked me when it happened. I have two friends that are both named Jay. Okay. We have we have a mutual friend his name's not Brian, but I'll call him Brian. I always call him Brian. So one day I get a phone call from Brian and he said, "Hey, I haven't talked to Jay in a while. Have you talked to him?" We have two friends with the same name, right? So what do you think my response is? Which Jay? What one are you talking about? In my head, I thought he was going to give me a last name because we both know their last names. That's common knowledge here. Instead, and you don't know this, but I'm going to tell you this now, they are of two different races. Instead, he says the Black Jay. And I'm like, why in the world would he say the Black Jay? That has nothing to do with this conversation. He just wants to know if I've heard from him, if he's okay. Why wouldn't he just say his name? His first and last name. Instead, he defaulted to that race. Okay, it happens all the time. We do that all the time. Maybe we'll go and we'll get our hair done at some salon, and we'll be telling someone about it, and they're like, "Oh, I want to go. What's their name?" I don't know their name, but and then you start to grasp onto how can I communicate this person to them. One of the first things we grasp onto naturally is race, because it's one of the first things you see. Typically it's one of the first things you see. Not always, because it's not always explicit, right? It's not always obvious, or there may be mixed race. But a lot of times that has nothing to do with the conversation you're having. That's just how you're choosing to identify that person. And that person may not choose to be identified that way. My buddy Jay, if he would have known that, he probably would have been offended because he just said, well, why couldn't he have just said my last name, right? Like, why did he have to bring my race into it? Why does my race always have to be an issue? So just be careful whenever you're doing things like that. It's easy here at the center. There's two people named Courtney now, and it's easy to say, gay Courtney or trans Courtney or whatever I am, right? Because that would distinguish us from each other explicitly. If you put us side by side, that is something you could say to where you would see the difference maybe between us. I would say, why don't you just say Courtney with short hair? Or why don't you just figure out my last name and say Courtney Lanham, right? So relying on kind of those identities, sometimes that perpetuates those stereotypes, and sometimes it also makes sure that you're clicking those lenses down in front of that person that's now going to be viewing them. Use the word disabled. Like she said before, it's not a bad thing. I sometimes blow people's minds when I'll tell you is having a disability is not a bad thing at all. There's nothing bad about it. What is bad about it is that having it innately is not bad, but what is bad is that our society has not done a good enough job to ensure the equality, to ensure the inclusiveness of individuals with various disabilities. You can go, I can go downtown Morgantown right now, and I can walk into most establishments, versus if I go down there and I am utilizing a wheelchair, I would say 75% of the establishments I cannot get into, if not more. And it's not just a Morgantown thing. It happens in DC. It happens everywhere. There are whole countries built on this. Look at the UK. If you've ever been to London, I walked around the whole place going, how do people in wheelchairs get around here? Do they leave their houses? Can they get into these houses? All of these questions. Our society is not built up for this. So making sure that you use these words not only helps with the visibility, but it helps take away from the fact that it's not a bad thing. It's just a variance of humans. The word cripple or crippled, that's one I hear a lot. Like I'll talk to one of my family members and they'll say, oh, if you talk to your uncle, he took a fell the other day and he's all crippled up now. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, "Well, he can't walk." Why didn't you just say that? Like, why do you have to say this? Because putting these other words, when we hear these, they elicit thoughts, they elicit feelings inside of us, and then those get projected onto that person or projected into that situation. So basically, I talked to you about identity first, or at least my video did. And I'll just tell you that, like she said, I'm going to echo it. Most of the time, the safest bet is to use person first or people first language. You're not going to offend people that way. However, I think that you should just ask people how they prefer to be referred to as. So without assuming. So without assuming that they want to be referred to as a person with a disability versus a disabled person, not assuming that just because their name and their voice is feminized that they want to be called miss or ma'am, things like that. So really taking away assumptions and asking people, what is your preference? Because I want to honor that. And also, if you don't know, defaulting to something that's a little safer. So if you don't know someone's gender, then or what their preference is, just default to the more neutral form of it, which is they and them. We do that whenever we're trying to hide someone's identity, right? I do. If I'm working with a client or I have a student who I need to consult with someone about, so let's say I'm working on a case and it's kind of difficult and I want to consult with one of my peers, but I want to keep it anonymous. So what I'll say is, instead of saying, she or he, I would say they or them. So it's just a way to keep it. So if we can do it to keep people anonymous, why can't we do it to make people feel comfortable or to not assume things? And that's kind of my biggest, and I'll removing my step box and stepping down off of it after that. But I think that's an error that a lot of people make. And I think we make it sometimes based on, what we're taught. Like I grew up in Appalachia, I was taught to call people ma'am and sir, but being someone who gets called ma'am a lot and it makes me uncomfortable, I've now modified it because I'm not viewing it as a way of being, rude. I'm actually viewing it as a way to be more respectful because I don't know if that's their preference. And I'm not going to assume it just to make myself and my mom feel okay about it because I used my manners that day. Instead, I'm just going to say, hey, I want to make sure I'm respectful as possible. What is your preference? Do you like be called Miss Lanham? Do you like being called Professor Lanham? What is it? In fact, I stand in front of my students every semester and I say, do not call me miss and do not call me ma'am, because I promise I will not answer you. You can call me Courtney, and they like to call me Professor Lanham. I don't really care about that, but I definitely don't like to be called miss and ma'am. And I tell them, like, I'm going to go ahead and tell you so you don't ever have to make the mistake and so you don't have to question it either. And sometimes it's easier doing that, but I have control over that classroom, right? I'm not going to stand up at a conference and raise my hand and say, I just want everyone to know in here that this is my preference. But if someone comes to me and says, hey, I want to be respectful, what's your preference? That's wonderful. I feel validated at that point in my life. And the same thing's going to happen when you talk to someone about, like, well, how do you want to be referred to in terms of your disability or your religion or whatever it is? Also, avoid saying things such as, these generalized terms. So the disabled, the epileptics, all of that. Making sure that you just say individuals with disabilities or individuals who are blind. Now, I will tell you that certain communities within the disability field, such as the seeing and vision, so blind community, they really strongly feel towards that identity first. So that community has labeled itself the blind community. But I will tell you that even though I guarantee there are people within that community who subscribe to person first language, who say that they don't want to be labeled that. So it's important to you can acknowledge these things, but just acknowledge that doing a general thing is not going to fully represent everyone in that community. And you may offend people within it. The next one is one that I don't think people think about very much. And it's using terms such as suffers from, a victim of, afflicted with. Those are used frequently. Clinically, they're used a lot. And what that does is those terms that it kind of puts sympathy towards the person. So you might say the person suffers from cerebral palsy. Okay. That means that, or at least in my head, if I hear that, and some other people may feel this way too, that, when you hear suffering, that they're struggling, that, they're going through it, that they need help, that it is a detrimental thing. But in reality, if you start to talk to people that have cerebral palsy, they're going to be like, it's just life, right? Things are a little more difficult to do, but I'm not suffering really. I'm striving because I could be bedbound or I could be in this situation. And so we just try not to use those terms. Instead, we explicitly call it what it is and we say that they're diagnosed with, because that's accurately what it is, or they have a diagnosis of. This last one is one, especially if you're a clinician, that it's going to be kind of like, people argue with me on this one, but I'll tell you why. And I'll tell you, this one's like the if and when type situations. So don't use terms such as normal, able-bodied, or neurotypical in as much as you can. So what I mean by that is that those terms are perfectly fine because we actually use those terms as diagnostic measurements and different things. Like if we're looking at someone at the age of 2 and we're comparing them to someone else, we're going to see where does the person with like autism differ from the person without. So we'll say that they differ from the norm in this way, or they'll differ from a neurotypical child in this way. So we are basing it exclusively on a measurement thing. However, when you talk, so clinician to clinician, it's fine. Researcher to researcher, it's fine. But when you talk to a parent, when you talk to a community member, when you talk to someone with a disability, when you start to say, this is where you fall in relation to someone normal or someone neurotypical, that can make them feel like they are an alien or there's something innately wrong with them. And like I said before, there's nothing wrong with having a disability. It's exclusively a variance of humans, such as our eye color, our hair color, all of these things. We're all different. But it kind of puts that presumption that there's something wrong with them innately. And we know that that's not the case. We just know that they're varying from what we typically see at that age or whatever it is. So just be really cautious whenever you're using terminology like this. You can use it in a clinical setting, but when you're talking to community members, when you're talking to families and all of that, we always avoid those. So this is my least favorite part of the training because I feel like I am obligated to say this word and I hate it more than anything in the world. I would rather be called every gay slur in the world than hear this come out of someone's mouth. But the university here at the center, and this guy right here, if you're a WVU fan, you might know him. A couple years ago, he was our mountaineer, John Kimball. He also was the one who got in trouble for shooting the black bear with the musket. So that's what he's known for, as the mountaineer. But he also was a trainee at our center here. He was actually a trainee when I first started. And John felt very strongly about individuals with disabilities, particularly intellectual developmental disabilities. He also felt that people in society were not doing enough to make them feel included. And one thing that he really wanted to help start up with us was this spread the word to end the R word. So this is the only time you're ever going to hear me say this, is exclusively in this context, exclusively when this slide is in front of me. And I only do it so no one can ever argue what word I mean by this, but we no longer use the word or the phrase or the diagnosis mentally retarded. It is no longer in the DSM. I always forget the date, but in like 2011, I think it was 2013, I believe, the DSM-5 was released. And at that point, we stopped using this diagnosis. So it has been shifted over to intellectual developmental disabilities. And of course, there's a lot of different things that fall underneath of that. So we tried to take this shift to really just, if we don't use it clinically, then really there should be no use for this word in our society, is kind of the frame of thought. And now that it's not being used clinically, then there's no argument that when it is being used, then it's being used in a derogatory way, which is exactly the only way that you would ever hear it used in our society. And when you hear people use it, I challenge you to maybe challenge them to find another word. I've had to have this conversation with my nephews recently. I had to set them down. They were saying, and I said, why? What do you mean by that? They're like, well, it's stupid. I'm like, then why don't you just say stupid? I said, that makes you look stupid that you can't find other words for your emotions, right? And he laughed at me, but I almost had to combat it with that because he didn't realize how painful this can actually be. So when you hear people say it, tell them, say, we don't use that word anymore. That's nothing more than a slur. Also know that some people will still have this in their like charts. And that is because they probably haven't had a good psychological in many years and no one's updated it. But really, we should be getting completely rid of the term MR and all of that. So that slide never makes me feel good inside. I don't feel like I should have to say that to people, but we do because we're still seeing it used. So this slide right here, whenever I do this training in person, particularly with my students, I really like them to do this as an activity, but we're not going to do it as an activity today for time reasons. However, I really want you guys to be mindful of this. So think about how media uses language. They use it a lot to really influence how we're hearing the message and also sometimes what we think about it and what we do with it. So find some examples in media. I like to find one situation. So maybe one event that's happened in the news, and I like to find it in at least 3 different media sources. So maybe I'll find it on CNN, and maybe I'll find it on BBC, and maybe I'll find it somewhere else. I don't know, Fox News. And then what I do is I start to see, so it's the same situation I'm looking at. Did the different medias, did they report on it differently? Did they use different language? One thing I always like to look at is, was the person involved or were the people involved, were things like their disability, were things like their race, any of those things noted? And if they were noted, did they contribute to the overall purpose of the story, or were they kind of filler things that might have been put there to elicit feelings in us? Because remember, whenever I said the word queer earlier, you may have had a history regarding that word that when you hear it or you see it, it's going to bring that history back to the forefront of your mind, right? So if we point out a certain person's race and you may have those biases that you carry, most of the time when that race is pointed out, it's going to come to the forefront of your mind, and then almost instantly that filter of race gets clicked down how you're viewing them. So I always like to say, like, okay, I'm going to take the same story, I'm going to look at 3 different ways, and I'm going to say, are they writing about the same thing differently? Are they using things that will elicit feelings? For things like that, for instance, maybe there's a story about somewhere getting robbed. Did they catch the person? Okay. If they did catch the person, did they note the person's race? Because if they said that it was a Black person robbing the place, but they've already caught the person, it to me is, why are you bringing up the person's race? You're not looking for them, right? You should have just said that the person who robbed the store was caught. So things like that, it happens a lot in media that we don't always pay attention to. And it sometimes can influence us. So if you see a story about an autistic person in the headlines, and then you go read about it, that's going to influence your perceptions on that based on what you know about autism or people who are autistic. Versus if you don't know that about them at all until the very end, then maybe your perceptions wouldn't have changed, or maybe you don't know it at all because it wasn't relevant to the story. So it had nothing to do with it. And what I find is that people will put those identities into things that they're not really relevant to. And I think that it's really to elicit kind of certain emotions in us, especially when you start to talk about mainstream media. So this is where we kind of take a slight shift away from person first language, and we really talk about disability etiquette. Now, of course, person first language or even like asking someone their preference and adhering to it would be part of etiquette behavior. But when we start to talk about disability etiquette, really, I want you to keep in mind that there's 3 core principles that drive or should drive your services or your interactions with that person. A person with a disability is not their disability. I think that one most people can get behind. Okay. I think we all know that, like, right? Like a person, like, I am not my race. I am not my gender. That's part of me, but that's not exclusively who I am. They also treasure their independence. That is one that I think there's a lot of ideologies around that. There's a lot of perceptions that people with disabilities are dependent of others, that they want to be dependent, that they want to stay on systems, that they want people to be caregivers and to rely on them. And we find that that's absolutely not the case. In fact, most people with disabilities are constantly striving towards independence. Now, they may be utilizing services or supports along the way, but their ultimate goal is to be as independent as possible. Now, the last one is the one that's the hardest for people to swallow, and that is that that individual is the expert. So that individual with a disability, that individual who is gay, that individual who's Black, whatever it is, they are the expert. Now, we may be the expert of a technique, of a diagnosis, or something like that. However, we only know the bookend part of it, right? We don't know what it looks like in their life. We don't know exactly how this intervention, now this may be a common intervention for this diagnosis, but we don't know 100% that it's going to work for that person. That person will have a better idea if it works for them or not. So always consulting with them and seeing where they come from. As educators, we think that we know how to teach people, right? We think that we're like, oh, great, yeah, we can teach in different modes. So we can, be kinesthetic. We can do all this stuff, right? But I guarantee you've come across a student, or you will come across a student, you're like, no idea. Everything I know, all my tricks of the trade aren't working. So that's where you work with that person and say, well, okay, well, what is it that works best for you? Let me find out these individualized details so I can better serve you and to make sure that you are getting the education you need. They will be the expert of how they take in your information. So making sure that you're constantly checking in with that person is extremely important. All right, so some more basic etiquette behavior, and then we'll kind of get into some distinct things in terms of diagnoses. But making sure that you speak directly to the person, and that's important, like if you're talking to someone who is non-English speaking as well, and they have a translator there, making sure that you're making eye contact and you're speaking to them and not their helper is extremely important. Also, when it's appropriate to offer to shake hands, do it. Now, you may think like, why does Courtney have this in these slides? That is very weird, because I have a story to tell you. So I was in New Mexico at a disability training institute, we'll call it loosely. So I was there with people from all over the country in the field of disabilities. And on my flight there, I met up with one of the other attendees of the institute who happened to be from another state. And we became instantly best friends. Like, you could not separate me and this guy. We were there the whole time together. We did everything except when we went to our hotel room or if we had to go to the restroom together. Everything was done together. So I'm standing there with my newfound best friend, and I'm standing there with 3 other of our colleagues from various parts of the country. So we're all just kind of talking. So I see someone who is very high up in the field of disabilities, and I will never say this person's name because I don't necessarily think that he intended to do this, but I see him approaching us. Well, I had met him a couple times. So I see him approach us, and at this point we're kind of standing, like he's here and we're kind of standing in a line in front of him. So he goes and he starts from there and he starts introducing himself to some of the others and shaking their hands. So he shakes the first 3 people's hands, gets to mine, and the last person in the line is my newfound best friend. Now, I didn't tell you something about my newfound best friend, but it's relevant that I tell you this at this point in time. My friend has cerebral palsy, and one of his hands is slightly drawn up. Not bad, slightly. So we're standing there, shakes hands, gets down to me, shakes hands. I said, nice to see you again. He's like, how's West Virginia, all that. Gets down to my new friend's hand, extends it, sees his hand, pulls back. So I see this and I'm like offended because I'm ready to fight for this guy because he's now my best friend, right? And I'm like looking, but I'm also acknowledging that this person in front of me is a lot more important than I'll probably ever be. So I'm looking and I'm seeing this interaction. I look at my friend's face and I immediately know what happened. Okay. So I know this person's intentions are not bad because of the context that they work in, right? Like that's just, they wouldn't be that way and be where they're at. So I'm thinking they just didn't think out. They just didn't think fast enough, or they just weren't thinking at all. I'm sure that he was scared of hurting my friend's hand, right? Because it was drawn up. He initially was going to shake it till he saw my friend's hand. Then he's like, oh, I might. And I'm sure his feelings were I might hurt this person because he has a physical disability, which a lot of people think. But what he communicated to the rest of us is that this person was not as valuable as us and did not deserve his handshake. That's exactly the look on my friend's face. If it had been anyone in the world, it probably would have been hurtful. But the fact that it was someone of the status that it was at and it was done in front of my friend's peers made it very hurtful. So what I tell people is that, for one, right now we're very grateful, or we're very thankful, because one, it would be weird to start going around shaking people's hands during COVID. So that's a plus side. Like that's good. So you don't have to worry about that. But when we go back to shaking hands, because I think we will as a society, touch is very important to humans. Scan the environment. Think about it. Or he could have scanned the environment as he walked up to us, because he could see us all standing there, right? He could have scanned it and figured out what was the appropriate approach to approach us. He could have tried to shake my friend's hand anyway and acknowledge that that wasn't my friend's first day at that rodeo. He's had that hand for who knows how long, right? He's in his 30s. He probably knows how to shake a hand. He would have maybe give him his left hand, or maybe he would have given him his other hand and he would have just shook it. Regardless, he assumed that he couldn't do it at all. So make sure that if you're ever in a situation like that, that you're not, even if you're not intending to, no one knows your intentions. I guess that man's intentions, and I'm probably pretty right. I would hope that I'm right. I would hope that it's not something else. But just know that people are only going to know, and they're only going to know of you what they see you behaving. So that impression will never leave my mind, no matter how wonderful I think this person is. I'm always going to see him walking up to my friend and jerking his hand away. So that's just kind of a little story of why I tell you, but it really makes a difference in not only the person, but also other people who perceive those situations. Offer assistance, don't just give it. Also, if it's accepted, make sure that you ask and you listen for instructions. The biggest part on the bottom is one that I think most people make the mistake when it comes to intellectual developmental disability, not necessarily physical disabilities. And that is to treat adults as adults. Just because someone has an intellectual functioning age does not mean that's their age. So there's a lot of times I'll sit across the table, and I'm a huge, I'm a big sexuality educator for disabilities in the state. Like I'm one of the few people that talks about it. I'm not big, but I'm one of the few people that talk about it in the state. And sometimes I've been known to kind of get pulled into a case to kind of help be a buffer for that topic. And I've been on cases where, the guardian will be like, well, okay, so I know that they're 30 years old. Chronologically, they're 30 years old. But, intellectually, they're only about 6 years old. They're only on about a 6-year-old level. I hear that all the time. My argument to that is, okay, so you're basing their intellectual developmental level, and that's based on a certain domain of their life, but that's not all inclusive, right? Because I'll also tell you that chronologically, hormonally, they're 30 years old. Emotionally, they may be 30 years old, but maybe academically is where you're talking about 6 years old. So just because there's that number that's put on this intellectual functioning does not mean that that's an inclusive representation of that person's abilities, and should be an inclusive representation of their access to things. And like I said, some of this, you're like, oh, well, yeah, no, duh, when it comes to relationships, but this happens in like the smallest details of a person's life, particularly a person's life who's not their own guardian. So making sure that, just because someone may be intellectually delayed, that you're not viewing them as anything more than what you would view their peers at the same age. Another one is just relax. So a lot of people get really uptight whenever, especially if they're like working with someone with a physical disability, because they don't want to hurt them or they don't want to say the wrong thing or anything like that. So just relax. They're individuals. Most people now, I jokingly tell people that disability is the only diversity group that anyone on here can join at any single time. Think about it. Most of you probably aren't going to join the LGBTQ community. And if you do join it, you probably somewhere up in your brain was already part of it, right? I'll tell you that you were, because I know the experiences. It's not something that just like a light bulb that turns on. You're like, I'm just going to do this. You're probably not going to change your race. You may change your religion. That's it. But really, when you think about it, having a disability is the only form of diversity which you can become a member at any time. And so making sure that you're conscious of that and you keep that in mind that at any moment you could be in this person's footsteps. I think that helps navigate these situations a little easier with a little bit more humility to them. Don't apologize if you happen to use a commonly accepted term or expression that may seem to relate to the person's disability. So for instance, I had a student, I was giving the student a tour around the building. And we have a coworker who, one of my colleagues she has no vision. She's blind. And I went in there to talk to her, and I had the student with me. I was like introducing them. And while we were in there, she was asking me a question about something. And we just kind of talked. And I was like, did you see, I think we were both like talking about America's Got Talent or something, like a show. And I said, did you see that act on America's Got Talent? And we were talking about it, and like we were going back and forth, and she's like, yeah, did you see this? Da, 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 da. So I'm sitting here having this conversation with my colleague, with my student present. We come back to my office and we're sitting there and we're doing other stuff. And my student stops me and says, I have to ask you something. At this point, she'd gotten more comfortable with me. I have to ask you something. I said, sure, go ahead. She said, you do know that your coworker's blind and can't see that show, right? And I said, well, yeah, no, duh. I was like, I'm not stupid. She's like, then why'd you kept asking her if she'd seen it? And I said, well, that's just a commonly used expression, right? Like, I know she's obviously not looking at the screen, but she was listening to it. She was taking it in. In her head, she probably had an image that was playing based on what she was taking in from the rest of her senses. It would have been really awkward if I'd have said to her, oh, Debbie, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to ask you if you had seen this. I meant to ask you if you had heard it, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Same thing where if I ask someone like, hey, do you want to run down the road with me? Or do you want to run down to the store with me? I say, my family says it all the time. That just means, do you want to go with me? I'm fat. I'm not going to run. Like, I'm not being literal and saying I'm going to run to the store. So if I say that to someone who's in a wheelchair, then I'm not, like, you know what I mean? Like, it may be an awkward thing. I don't literally mean that. But sometimes what happens is when people are talking to individuals with disabilities and they say something like that, that's just like a common expression, they get really caught up on it. And then they get really insecure about it. Much like whenever you misgender someone. So maybe you call someone ma'am or sir, and then they open their mouth and you think they're a female. So what happens? I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do it. I'm so sorry. Well, that just makes the person feel awkward. Just say, if you feel like you need to apologize, just say, hey, sorry, didn't mean to say that, and then move on. But what happens is a lot of times people kind of get in there and they get stuck in their own emotions and their own uncomfortableness of it. And then it just keeps getting rehashed. And then everyone feels awkward. Don't be afraid to ask questions when you're not sure what to do. Now, I would preface this by saying, don't ask questions necessarily about the person's disability unless it's your job or unless you're really comfortable with the person. Same thing as like, would you just approach someone of a different race on the street and start asking them things about their race? Well, no. But if you were treating them for something and maybe it had to do with there was something that made them at a higher risk because of their race, then you would talk about it. Or maybe if you're already friends with that person and you're curious, then you can initiate that conversation. But you have to be really careful about what you ask people, especially if you don't have a good existing relationship with them. And I say that because I have a lot of people who are very curious about things and they'll like know that I'm an open book so they can come to me, but then they'll go to other people and like assume that they're an open book too and then get told off and then come back to me and be like, well, you didn't tell me off. I'm like, Well, yeah, because you know me. Like that was someone you didn't know. I'd tell somebody off too if they were a stranger and just walked up and asked me that. So making sure that you do that, but also keep in mind that not everyone wants to be the disability educator for you about their disability, or the gay educator or the Black educator. It's, if you're curious about it, there's a ton of resources out there to look it up and then come back to them and say, okay, well, I looked this up. Tell me how this affects you in your life, and have those kinds of conversations, but don't leave it up to them to tell you everything about their diagnosis or whatever it is. This is one that is one of the hardest ones as an animal lover, is that acknowledging that service dogs are working tools. So you can't feed them, pet them, or anything like that. Now, it is okay to ask for, the handler, if you know them very well, to see if you can. So for instance, I told you about my one colleague, she has a dog. And yesterday before the end of, or at the end of the day, I was walking down the hallway and I saw that she was standing in front of one of my colleagues' offices and the dog was standing there. Well, this dog and I have a serious like love relationship for each other. Like she sees me, I see her, we're like Google eyeing, like she knows I smell like my dogs and she likes to smell me. So we love each other. But I also know that I can be a distraction for her while she's trying to work with my colleague. And then that can put her in danger. So I know that I have to be really careful. So I'm like, if I see her, she walks past me, I'm like I won't look at her. And I have to try really hard. But yesterday, I knew it was the end of the day. I knew that, my coworker probably wasn't, I could see that she was doing other stuff right then. So I go up to him. I said, hey, I said, Molly sees me. She saw me at the end of the hallway and I saw her. If she's not busy right now, can I pet her? And of course, my coworker says yes. Now, there's been times when she's like, well, I'm getting ready to leave and I need her to take me here. I'm like, okay, then I'm not going to pet her because I know as soon as I pet her, she wants to smell me and then she's distracted by me, right? So in some contexts, it's okay. In other contexts, it's not. But I will tell you that that is the hardest part of my job, is to not pet Molly, because we love each other. Also, don't make assumptions about anything and about anyone. Okay. I think we all figured that out in life by now, right? We've all made that error in life, that we've assumed something. Just ask the person. Keep in mind what you're asking them in your pre-existing relationship with them, though. Also, this is one that I don't think a lot of people know or think about, but know where your accessible restrooms, drinking fountains, and phones are. Even on the university. So like, I know when I go to let's say Nap Hall, I don't know. I'm having a blank right now on the building I normally teach in, because I haven't taught for like 2 semesters because of COVID. But let's say I go into Nap Hall, which is historically one of the older buildings on campus. There will be restrooms that are labeled accessible, or they're labeled handicap now, because that's what our society is using. But then I'll go in there, and if I have a backpack on my shoulder, I can't turn around in there. I'm like, how does someone with a wheelchair, how are they going to fit in here, right? So I will find a bathroom that maybe is bigger, and I make sure that I know where it is. So I know if someone asks me, or if I see someone looking for it, or if I happen to be in the restroom and I see someone struggling, I can say, hey, if you go to the 2nd floor at the end of the hallway, there is a more accessible restroom. So I can tell them that. Or, just knowing where they are, to where if you have a meeting or if you have someone coming in, you do that. If you were to schedule this training with me at your facility, so if I was doing this in person, one of the first things I would have asked CJ about the facility is, do you have accessible restrooms and fountains? I don't care if she knows the audience that she's training to. I don't care if she knows every single one of you intimately, to know that you don't need that. What if you broke your leg the day before and then you're coming in there? What if I bring someone in as a guest speaker with me and they need that facility? So I want to know where they're at. And if you don't have them, then I don't want to do a training there, because I think it's that important. Now, that might be me being picky working in the field of disabilities, but I think you need to know these things. If you've got a class, like, make sure you know the building. That way, if someone in your class needs it, they can do it. Like I said before, any of us can join that need at any time, right? So any of us could fall and break our legs and be on crutches and need a larger stall to use the bathroom in. So it's not just if you know your audience, but that audience could change. So make sure you know where those are. So this is where we get into kind of some of the finer details, and when you're talking about disabilities, and some of these I've already touched on, and some of them, are obvious, but we'll just kind of go over them again. The biggest things that I want you to know is that when you're talking to someone that's utilizing a wheelchair, make sure that you're on their level. And this is for multiple things. If you are standing over top of them and having a conversation with them, they're going to have to look up to you. Well, one, that's a power differentiation, having to look up to someone, right? Like, that's uncomfortable. I don't like people towering over me. Even if it is someone of power, I don't like them towering over me. For two, if I have to do this for so long, is that going to feel comfortable, or is your neck going to hurt? It's probably going to hurt, right? So you want to make sure that you're making them feel comfortable, and also you're comfortable. So if you're having notable chats or prolonged chats, just sit down so you're on eye level with them. Also, make sure that when you're offering help, that you're not assuming that they want it, and you're not assuming the kind of help that they need. So if you say, hey, can I help you? And they say yes, say, okay, how can I help you? I'm going to give you another story. This is how I like to do things. I like to tell stories. So we did a conference, and I have another really good friend who he actually just moved to LA. He was living in DC, but he utilizes a wheelchair. And I had to pick him up at the airport one day for this conference that he was going to speak at for me. I brought him as a guest speaker. So I go pick him up at the airport, and I was like, hey, how do I need help? Do I need to help you get in the car? Do you want help? I think I said, do you want help? He said, sure. Yeah. He's like, you'll just need to put my chair in the back. I said, cool. Now, I had no idea how to put this chair in the back. I probably could have fidgeted with it and figured it out, right? But I'm sitting here looking at this chair, and I'm like, I don't see any release buttons to because it was different than any chair that I'd ever I've used wheelchairs before for various, and you pull the seat up and it kind of collapses them down. So I'm thinking maybe we'll do that, right? That's not the case. He had this really nice titanium chair, and I work in the field of disabilities, and I know that it was probably a fight for him to get that chair. And if something happens to it, it's not guaranteed that he's going to get another one anytime soon, if at all ever. So I understand that is a valuable, plus it's also an extension of his body in a way. He uses it. So I want to be respectful. I said, okay, I don't know how to do this, and I don't want to break your chair. So can you tell me how to do it? So then he tells me that in the center of the wheel, there's a button. Well, around the spokes go around it. If you push that, it pops the wheel off. So all I do is push that button, pop each wheel off, then put the seat in the thing. I would have never guessed that. And I probably would have broke the chair if I tried it. Especially knowing me, that whenever I get frustrated, I go hard into the paint, and I just start pulling stuff apart. Okay. So it was really important that I listened to his instructions and I took them, because I could have caused him physical damage if I would have just I could have picked him up and put him in the car, right? He was small enough, I literally could have picked him up, but I could have caused him damage. And I also could have been really intrusive on his rights and on his physical, his space. Could have broke his chair and cost him thousands of dollars. Or, he was from DC. He was in West Virginia at the time. Where was he going to get another chair? If I'd have broke his chair, I'd have had to carry him around the whole conference on my back, right? Because he wouldn't have had a chair. So making sure that you're really aware of that kind of stuff is extremely important. My intentions were good. I just had to make sure I executed them correctly. This is another big one, is follow through with whatever needs to be done or whatever you've started before you exit. So for instance, if you're helping, let's say you're helping someone who's in a wheelchair put dishes away in the top cabinet. And let's say you're like, oh, I need to go do this, or I want to go do this really quick. I'll be right back and I'll help you do this. Maybe that person wants it done. Or maybe if you just walked away, they just thought that maybe you just abandoned them. So what are they going to do? More likely they're going to try to do the task themselves. And then could that put them in danger of being injured? It could. Or maybe you have pulled out all this stuff around in their closet, and they're in the corner of the room, and you leave the room, and then they're like, well, I can't even get out of this room if I wanted to. And they have to wait on you to come back. So just make sure that you complete any tasks, or at least have a plan with them to complete it, and make sure that they're okay to navigate around it if you're doing anything with them. Do not use the wide bathroom stalls unless you really absolutely are having an emergency. So, I tell people at my work, like, they're like, well, can we use them? I'm like, okay, yes. Like, if you need to go in there and it's an emergency, like you're about to use the restroom by yourself, go use it. But don't go in there and pull out your phone and check Facebook, or like, let me go ahead and let me knock out this level of Candy Crush while I'm in here, right? Uh, don't laugh, because we all do it. Like, I guarantee everyone takes their phone to the bathroom with them at some point. But don't do it when you're in the big stall, because someone may come in there and they may need to use that one. And maybe think of it this way, most of us, when we have to go to the restroom, what do we have to do? We have to take off a belt, maybe unbutton some pants, and you sit down, you go to the restroom. But if someone's in a wheelchair, maybe they have to transition, maybe they have to unbutton, like maybe there's other steps that come into play. So if they're already on the brink of having to use the bathroom, you don't want to delay it any further for them, because you don't want them to have an accident on themselves. So just be conscious that, just because you can get in and out fast doesn't mean someone else can. So try to avoid those if possible. Blindness or low vision. Always identify yourself and others whenever you enter a room or you're coming around someone who is blind or has low vision. And also never touch or grab the person to necessarily get their attention. If you need to get their attention, all you have to do is just speak to them. And if you absolutely have to, just lightly touch their arm. Nowhere else, just lightly touch their arm. And that'll get their attention. Also, don't assume that they want your help. I never assume that my colleague wants my help. She knows that if she needs it, I'm there. I always tell her, hey, I'm never going to help you. I'm never going to force my help onto you. But if you ever want it, all you got to do is ask, and I'll be there to give it. Make sure that if you do offer assistance and they accept it, that you let them know that what you're going to do. So if you're helping guide someone in particular, never grab them. Don't touch them. You've probably seen it. Let them grab your elbow, or let them lock their arm, like kind of put their hand through here. Because what that does is they'll go with the movement of you versus you moving them with you. Okay. Because if you pull their arm, I don't know about you guys, but like my nephew was bad when he was a kid, and I would take him places and he would run off, and I would go and I'd grab his arm, and I wouldn't squeeze it or anything like that, but I would move him towards where I wanted him with his arm, right? Because you kind of have that, you're like pulling them. Versus if you let them grab you, they're going to go along with your lead. So you're not going to pull them. They're going to stop when they feel you stop, versus you stopping them. And that's just a little bit better way of making sure that they don't fall or any abrupt things like that. Also, sometimes we don't realize how powerful we really are until we start to do things, and you don't want to maybe be too forceful with someone. This one right here is the one, and I'm the first person to admit my mistakes to you guys, and I probably shouldn't be this open about them, but that's the only way we're ever going to learn. This next bullet is the one that I probably am the most guilty of. And it is letting them know whenever you leave the room. So I will go down to my colleague's office to ask something, like we'll talk about something. Let's say I need a paper, like she works with some students. So I'll say, hey, I need this student's background check form so I can make sure, we have it on record. And I'll get what I need from her, because we pop in and out of offices all the time, right? We'll say, hey, can I get this from you? And then we leave. Well, we take for granted the fact that most people see us leaving. There's been times when I've done that and I've gotten partially down the hallway and I hear my coworker still talking to me. And then I feel terrible, because I'm like, oh my gosh, she thinks I'm still in there. And I don't want her to think that she's not a valid person, or that I'm like paying it. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's a very awkward thing. And so it's like if you're on the phone with someone and you hear them going, uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. You're like, you're not paying attention to me. You're just going, uh-huh. So I will always go back and say, you know how ADHD I am. It flared up on me. I'm all hyper. Didn't mean to leave you without saying bye. What was it that you said, or whatever it is? And then I'll say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and go now. And then I'll leave. Because unless you're a loud walker or heavy breather or something, like that person may not have any idea that you're no longer in the room. So you have to be super aware of that. And once again, that is one that I make errors on all the time, and I have to constantly try to be a better person and do better We already talked about like introducing people whenever they enter the room. Same thing with greeting. If you want to shake someone's hand, like we all know, like that's a visual cue, right? But let's say they may not be able to rely on that visual cue because of vision issues. So all you have to do is say, hey, how are you doing? Let me shake your hand. And most people are going to extend out and then you grab their hand and shake it. It's not that big of a deal. Address them by name in a conversation, especially if you're in a large group of people, so they know that you're explicitly talking to them, because most people you would just look at and they would see you looking at, but these people, this may not be something that's available for all people. Speak in a normal tone and speed of voice. Just because they can't hear you doesn't mean they can't, or just because they can't see you doesn't mean they can't hear you. And that's a common misconception. Now, some people may not be able to, but most people have ability to. And then, of course, this last one right here, and this is such a big one. Oh, I can't stress this one enough. Direct your conversation to the person rather than someone who might be their helper. So beyond, blindness, things like that, I have interpreters in all the time. I'll have someone who needs an AL or ASL interpreter, so sign language. And what I'll tell you is that is a situation you may very well encounter in your education and all of that. You may have a student who needs one. Don't talk to the interpreter, okay? That person is exclusively a tool for that individual to be using. They are not the person that you should be like consulting with. Look and talk directly to the person you're talking to, and that other person will be there to assist them. Same thing, like if you're providing and you have a teenager come in with their parent. I always say, talk to the teenager. You don't exclusively talk to the parent. They need to be involved in their services. They need to be involved in their treatment. And the same thing is for individuals with disabilities. Like that interpreter is nothing more than a useful tool for them. They're the ones that should be driving everything and making decisions. Speech impairment. So when you talk about different patterns of speech, stuttering, different things like that, making sure that you make the person feel comfortable and not rushed. I like to, especially if I start to note that they're getting more rushed, I will say, hey, do you want to go to a more quiet space to talk? Because they may be feeling like they need to rush because the environment's too chaotic, or they don't know if you can hear them, understand them, and all of that. Don't complete their sentences. Make eye contact. So I don't hear all that great sometimes, especially on my right ear. And so a lot of times if you talk to me, I will stare at your mouth sometimes because I'm relying on your mouth to fill in the gaps of what I'm not hearing. Because I hear most of it, but I would say I miss about 10%. So I'm using your mouth to fill those gaps in. But if someone has a speech impairment, or they have like maybe a varied speech pattern, staring at their mouth can make them feel really self-conscious. So in those situations, I try really hard not to, and I try really hard to keep eye contact. Also, listen to the person's words, not the manner in which they're said. That's extremely important that you do that, because maybe they have very forced language. So maybe they have they have cerebral palsy, and it affects their motor skills in their face and all of that, and their language. So maybe you're hearing a very forced pattern, or you're hearing very like sharp words coming out in the way that they're being said. But what's more important is that you're listening to actually what they're saying. This is another big one that I always tell people, and I've had to really practice this in my whole life, is if you don't understand them, ask them to repeat. Now, if they repeat and you still don't understand them, do not pretend that you did, okay? We've all been, so I see people laughing because I guarantee everyone's made this mistake. Even if a child comes to you and a child's talking to you and you're like, well, this is really cute. They're trying really hard. And you'll say, uh-huh, yeah, okay. Problem is that you have no idea what you just, yeah, okay, to. You could have yeah, okay to something that was really bad, right? Or maybe they were telling you something traumatic. Maybe they were telling you something emotional. And then you responded to, yeah, okay. And then they're like, I just told you about being raped. Why did you respond to yeah, okay? Now that's a very extreme version, but it happens. So make sure that if you don't understand someone, that you just say, hey, I sometimes I'll say it funny. I'll say, I'm not picking up what you're dropping down to make, especially if it's a kid, but I'll just say, I'm not understanding. So can we go somewhere? Can you help me understand better? Because I want to make sure that I'm fully understanding you versus just appeasing them and just saying, yeah, okay. But we do that with kids all the time too. And it's dangerous if the kids start asking various things. People are shaking their heads like, yeah, I've done this with my kids. I do. I've had to do like disaster control afterwards because of it. Yeah. So, if you're not understanding them, ask it, repeat back what you think you heard. So you're saying, I don't know if I heard you correctly. So this is what I think you said. And then give them the chance to say yes or no. And then that lets them know that you're trying really hard to understand them too. If you need to, give them another way to communicate with you. So say, do you want to write it down? Do you want to type it? Do you want to use an assistive technology device? So like, do you want to use a PEC system or something like that? So give them alternatives that may make them feel more comfortable. If you're uncertain how to communicate with someone or the best way, just ask them. Say, I've had people where I don't like communicating through text a whole lot or email, especially if it's about like a complex thing, because I don't want to misread things or take things the wrong way. So I'll say, if we're going to have a really complex conversation, can we have it face to face or can we have it through Zoom? That way, like I can hear your words instead of reading them. So even things like that and allowing for modifications. If you give instructions in class verbally, follow up with giving them in writing. So do an email after class and say, hey, I know that I gave you guys these instructions. I just want to follow up because you may be able to meet people's learning styles differently than that. So it's not even all the way to the point of disabilities, but it's just ways that you can meet people where they're at better. Hearing loss. So speak normally, particularly if people are wearing hearing aids, those are tuned for it. If they can't hear you, then they need a hearing aid adjustment. But I will see a lot of times people where they'll take note that they'll see the hearing aid and they'll say, okay, well, this person can't hear very well, so I better yell. And I'm like, if they don't have their hearing aid in maybe, but they have it in, so you yelling is probably like hurting their ears and causing them discomfort. So don't do that. Keep your face and mouth visible for lip reading. So even if you're teaching in front of a class, make sure that you're standing and you're facing them for multiple reasons. So they can see you, so you're keeping their attention. Also, like even people who can hear some, like our ears are shaped a certain way to capture sound. Our ears are pointed frontwards, slightly to the side to help us in case so something can't sneak up on us. But a majority of our sound that we intake is going to come in like this. If you see people doing like things like this, that means they can't hear you very well. So make sure you're standing in front of them and you're facing them so they can at least read your lips. So for someone like me, I can hear you, but I'm only gonna get about 90% what you say. So if I can see your lips, I can see your facial expressions, then I can fill in those gaps. Don't exaggerate speech or emotion. So this is another one where if people are using your physical demeanor to fill in the gaps, that you can kind of make accidents. So I always tell people, be careful when you talk, or if you're talking with your hands, you better mean it. Now, I do this a lot. The other day I was talking to someone and I kept doing this. They were like, what is this about, Courtney? I was like, I don't know, point across, I guess. I need to make sure you're paying attention to me. So I do these things. But I've also worked in the field of disabilities and I've worked with people long enough that I've also picked up on a couple signs to where I don't even realize it sometimes. But if I'll say like eat, I'll go eat or something like that, or like thank you, things like that. So if I do that accidentally without realizing, because also I'm trying to learn sign language more, and the way you learn it is to use it while you're speaking. Let's say I accidentally make the wrong sign. Let's say it could be offensive. I have to be very careful of that because that may send a different message to that person who's relying on signs or something like that. So you have to be really careful when you're doing all these gestures and all that. Also, I always tell people your face better match your topic. So what I mean by that is that I'm never going to present on a heavy topic with a smile on my face. So I'm never going to be talking about rape and smiling, right? Now, it happens because sometimes we get awkward and we'll do that. But what that does is if that person's filling in the gaps with your body language, you're going to cause a lot of confusion there. So making sure that, especially if you know someone's in the audience that has some hearing loss or something like that, that you're being very conscious of your body language because they may be relying on it to fill in those gaps. Also, I talked about this already about a translator being present, address the person, but make sure that, especially if you have a translator present, that you are not making sudden changes in topics. And this is because there's always going to be a slight delay, right? The translator has to hear what you're saying, and then they physically have to sign it out. And then that person has to see that sign and process it. So there's a slight delay from the moment it leaves your mouth to the moment it takes into the brain of the recipient. So you want to make sure you're not doing any quick changes. Also, if you have an interpreter coming in, this is the only time I ever really it's not really the only time I ever really talked to an interpreter. I'll introduce myself, say hi, thanks for coming. But I also let them know, hey, I have some high level content here. So I may have some very distinct words, some theoretical frameworks, some things like that, that you may not have a sign for, or you may need to come up with another way to describe it. So a lot of times I'll give them a heads up. And if I know that it's heavy content, I'll provide it to the interpreter before, so they already know what's coming ahead, so they can make accommodations for that, for when they do it. Because let's keep in mind, like, if you're teaching, like, I don't know, biology, there's probably not a sign for every single word at every single like molecule name or whatever it is. So you're going to have to give them some time, that interpreter some time to get something equivalent to where that person can get the information, or give them time to where they can spell the word out or whatever it is the means, which is typically what they do. If there's not an alternative word for it or a sign for it, a lot of times they'll just spell the word out.
Courtney, I hate to interrupt such great information, but we are coming up on time. So I just wanted you to know some folks may be dropping off with scheduling conflicts.
Absolutely. One thing, and this is the last slide actually. So if you can, just hold 1 second, and then I'm
I sure
gonna
will.
put a link in the chat. So the biggest thing I want you guys to remember, especially when you're dealing with intellectual cognitive disabilities, learning disabilities, or anything like that, is that really just to not make any assumptions. Also, whenever you're dealing with people with intellectual disabilities, they may respond in ways that may give us a message that they're angry or anything like that. But just keep in mind that instead, they may be communicating with you that they're overwhelmed or that they don't understand, or something along those lines, versus them being defiant. So, like I said, this is the last slide. I kind of cover the stuff throughout, so I put it at the end just as a wrap up. But the take home being is that for this whole training is that to make no assumptions at all. Don't assume what people want to be referred to as. Don't assume that what you're doing is going to meet everyone's needs. And don't assume that if you have an answer to something, it's the right answer for every situation. So given that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to open it up for any kind of questions. I am going to post 2 links in the chat, and I will give these to CJ as well. The first link is a post test. It just kind of evaluates, like, did you guys get anything from this? A lot of the things in this one were questions that I asked at the beginning of the training because I wasn't able to get you the pre-test before. So when I said answer some things in the chat, those were kind of these kind of questions. The second one is my training evaluation. Oh, and for some reason it went to CJ only. Is my training evaluation. And that just kind of lets me know how it went, lets me know if you want any more additional information on the topics or if there's any trainings that I could follow up with for you. So if there's no questions, that's all I have for you guys today.
Are there any questions for Courtney? It was really great information.
Thank you.
Hey, Courtney, I don't want to hold anybody up, but I do have a question for you.
Absolutely.
And it's back to when you were talking about mental retardation. I use the terminology in class, and I'm just wanting to make sure I clarify because you were hesitant to even use it in this presentation. I use it in class in a historical perspective. I also use idiot, imbecile, monster as in a historical perspective. I give the same lesson that you're giving, that, you know, these are no longer terms that are appropriate to use. Do you have any issue with doing that?
No, not necessarily. You're using it, it sounds like you're using the exact same context which I was using it in to let you
Yeah.
know that it's not a term that we use any longer. If you're using a historical text, remind them that, and I think it's important that we continuously remind them that this is not a term we currently use. It's not a current diagnosis. You can let them know that the shift was from the 4TR to the 5 is whenever it changed. And the reason I say that is because I still see practitioners out there who are still like writing this down, who are still
Right.
seeing this.
I
So
got you.
I'm seeing it used clinically still. So that's where I'm still like, if I'm saying it, they know I'm saying it to let them know that it was historically used and it's wrong to use it now. And I remind them multiple times of that.
We're doing the same thing then.
I
Thank
hate using that word.
you.
And it's only because I've been there with people and I've seen and I've processed with them their emotions around when they've been called that, or when they've been somewhere and they've heard someone calling someone else that. I see that flip side that a lot of other people don't have the privilege of seeing. I see the effects of it. So that's where, like, even saying it in an educational setting, it almost like I physically feel it when I say it. And that's just because of my history with it. But yeah, I think contextually, I think that you're fine in that. In fact, we need to be telling people not to use it.
I just
Thank
want to add
you.
a little bit more to that, Courtney, as well. I have a brother that is severely intellectually disabled, and but the one thing I'm finding though with viewing his paperwork, because of course, all growing up, it was he was MR, and I found too that I would say it because that's what I grew up with. He's my older brother, but I'm finding though, that on viewing his paperwork, that the word autism is also kind of getting to the point where it's being misused, because a lot of his documentation is now saying he's autistic. Well, he's not. He has rubella syndrome. He has cerebral palsy. So I'm kind of concerned that because of the spectrum, with the autism spectrum, that too might get to the point where that word, or that diagnosis is going to be more and more put out and maybe misused as well. So that's what my one concern is.
And I kind of have a couple gut feelings when I hear you say that. And one is that I do think like we throw around like, oh, I think they might. Well, we threw it around a little bit more like I think they might be a little aspy, or I think they might be a little on the spectrum, when we're really just talking about quirky people, right? Or things like that. One thing that I will tell you is that we're no longer, you were right in that you saw MR, you saw that word, you saw that as a diagnosis, because it was a legit diagnosis up until, I really think it was like, I'm trying to think, like, I think it was like 2013. I think it was 2012, 2013 is when it dropped. Fun fact, I've read every single issue of the DSM front to cover. I'm a little bit of a weirdo when it comes to it, but now you should not be saying it because there is no clinical use for it, because it's no longer a diagnosis. So it shouldn't be in his paper. It shouldn't be in newer paperwork. Let's put it that way. It should be getting updated. That access should get updated. Now, seeing autism in there and you saying that there's never been a diagnosis, to me, then there has been an issue in communication from one provider to another. Or if there's never been testing for it or anything like that, then we have someone that maybe, and I don't want to say this happens a lot, but I will say it happens. Maybe they wrote a treatment plan by copying and pasting someone else's treatment plan and forgetting to remove all the information.
It's possible.
I've got
Yeah.
them with other people's names halfway through them before pronouns change. I would lie to you if I told you it didn't happen in the field. It does. So my thing would be that I would question that, because especially with something like autism, that can really affect potential care for the future. So like, and how people perceive it, how people treat, like how people decide what medications to give, what different means of therapies to give, and things like that. Now, maybe somewhere along the lines, maybe this is something that's gone undiagnosed and you guys just are too close to the forest to see the whole thing, right? To see all the trees. So maybe that's it. So if it's something that's standing out, I would question to make sure it's not an error. And I wouldn't ask if they're saying it's not, I would say, do you have the assessment results to back that?
That's a good point. Yeah, because I've never really asked for the assessment. My brother used to live at home up until my mom had a terminal cancer diagnosis. So now he's a resident at Allegheny Valley Schools. And so, of course, I'm grateful that they still include us in, the process and decision making. But like I said, I always was kind of taken back when I would see that as a diagnosis, because again, I'm like, no, he rubella syndrome, cerebral palsy, a lot of the, tendencies are similar. I mean, they have similar tracks of, where they show, some of their concerns, but no, it's been there underlying. He's 50 some years old, so but I might question it the next time, because I am a little curious about that.
I'd question that. I would see who put that in the documentation, what was their basis. It could be an error. It could be someone learned a whole lot about autism recently and they think that they can label it. It's it can go a lot of ways, but I will tell you that I've seen things come from facilities that have been copy and pasted and accidentally stuff get left in.
Yeah. But I also been finding younger youth, and again, it's the same thing with correcting whenever you hear someone say the word retarded, but some are like, oh, that's just so autistic, or, they're starting to throw that term out there. And I'm like, nah, let's not go there either. So
yeah. Well, I mean, we do that a lot. We did it with ADHD for a long time. I legit am ADHD. So when I say mine's flaring up, like I'm not lying to you, like I'm going through some things. It's flaring up, but we'll see other people and we'll see kids that will say, oh, I just think they're ADD, because we focus in on this one symptom we're seeing, versus if you open the DSM, you don't just have to have one symptom to meet a diagnosis. Most diagnoses, you have to have like 3 out of 5, or, you have to meet these other things. So just because you meet one criteria doesn't, if I only had to meet one criteria, I would probably, and most of us on this call would probably have 75% of the things in that book. It's just the way it is, right? Like, it's like, oh, well, you have a deficit in one domain of your life. Well, all of us have a deficit in one domain of our life, right? So I'd question that a little bit more. I wouldn't like that for my brother, if you know what I mean, just because I also know that for good and bad reasons, there's a stigma that goes along with each diagnosis, and autism's one that has a huge stigma right now in our society. So I definitely question that.
Thank you. Yeah, I will.
Any other questions? Okay, so I think Friday, CJ, am I right on this? Friday, I am doing the accessibility training for you guys.
Yes, and you'll have a healthy crowd, Courtney, I think, because I think most of our faculty will be with you, and Doug, right?
Well, I'm not sure if Doug will join. I'm going
Okay.
to double check, but if Doug can't join us, I'll be there doing it.
Okay. And some other staff members as well. So we'll have a good time.
Great. So I'll let you guys know, heads up, this isn't an interactive training. So there will be times I ask you to kind of minimize your screen and pull up PowerPoint and do different things. If that's an issue and if time restraints is an issue, what I'll do is I'll kind of assign a homework assignment to you guys to where you learn how to do it from what I'm teaching you. And then you just email me a PowerPoint and I'll check it and give you feedback. But I do want to let you guys know that I'm going to send CJ a pre-test for that one. So just CJ, if you can disseminate that to anyone who will be attending, I would greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, I sure will. I sure will do that. That sounds fantastic. So I will also make sure I follow up with everyone who attended this one as well to make sure they have the links that you've shared. And we're really looking forward to Friday. I think it's going to be a great training.
All right. Well, thank you guys. And if you need anything in the meantime, just shoot me an email.
Okay, I will do it. Well, thank you. We'll see you on
All right.
Friday.
See you guys Friday. Take care.